In this episode, I am once again joined by Mattias Daly, Taoist practitioner and translator of Taoist Inner Alchemy, published by Shambala. Mattias tells the story of his possession by a malevolent entity, a demon attached to his ancestral line for generations. Mattias details the progression of his symptoms and his terror as the possession began to take deeper hold on his body and mind. Mattias recounts several dramatic attempts at exorcism, working with ritualists from Taoist, Catholic, Tibetan Buddhist, Spiritualist, and Māori traditions in increasingly desperate attempts to rid himself of the entity. Mattias also explains various theories of demonology, the steps he now takes to avoid contact with such forces, and reveals the surprising reasons why he is sharing his story now for the first time in public. So without further ado, Mattias Daly. Mattias Daly, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
I'm so pleased to be talking with you again. The previous two episodes we recorded about your life and your journey as a practitioner and as a translator, as well as your latest publication, Taoist Inner Alchemy, a fabulous translation that's now available everywhere and really excellent. Highly recommended. Today we're going to take a turn in an interesting direction. In the first episode, when we went through your biography, we arrived at a period of time you spent in New Zealand. And some things happened during that period that we thought best to treat in its own episode. So those who have heard the first episode will know we sort of said a few things about it, and then we sort of moved on and we agreed to come back to it and treat it in its own right. And that's what we plan to do here. So you are arriving in New Zealand. Perhaps you can say why you've arrived in New Zealand, what's brought you there, what age are you, and then continue the narrative.
So my mom is a Kiwi, born in Timaru, raised in Christchurch, South Islander, 100% Pakeha, for those who know what that means. It means we are not of Maori descent or Moriori descent. We are of the European stock. That is, Pakeha is the Maori word for that, but everyone in New Zealand knows this term. And so I'm a passport holder, citizen of New Zealand, and at about 23, I just kind of felt like I should go live there for a while. My mom always wanted me to connect with my family on that side more closely, and I was kind of, to some degree, intentionally trying to put space between myself and my location in Chicago, where a lot of the adventures and hijinks we talked about last episode were going on. And of course, New Zealand is a truly beautiful place on planet Earth, and it hardly needs a reason to go there. And it had been my plan to kind of settle down for a period of time and see about working and making a life for at least a few years there. So that was what had sort of spurred me to move to New Zealand in the first place. So this is the very beginning of 2007, and I was 23 at the time. And I just visited China and for the first time, as well as Tibet on the way over. That's kind of how I ended up landing there. Now, in that time when I showed up, I had been, as I described in the last episode, I had kind of run off the rails in life in a lot of ways, and I had gone looking for mentorship and what turned into guidance in a lot of Taoist teachings, ranging from the ethical and philosophical to the practical in terms of meditation practice and some Qi Gong, standing, sitting meditation, Qi Gong practice. And the sort of events that really kicked off in New Zealand, in a lot of ways, they started while I was still in Chicago. Not directly, but it's something worth talking about because this is very pertinent to Taoist practice. And a lot of people will have the potential to pass through something similar if one engages with meditation or Qigong, and not necessarily unique to Taoism. What I am about to describe, if you've been to a 7-day Goenka retreat, I remember vividly Goenka talks about one of his students, I think was a German metallurgist, perhaps, in working with making rockets. And he described how this German fellow at his meditation center, this was back when Goenko was still alive and teaching in person, and his students at his retreats had a personal cell, was during the meditation time, occupying all kinds of bizarre postures and making strange facial expressions. This is spontaneous reactions to stillness. And in Chinese, they tend to be referred to in modern Chinese as 自法功, which is a combination of 3 characters, one meaning, it can mean self, it can mean sort of like by its own nature. Fa is here means emerging, and gong kind of means skill. So some would even call it spontaneous skill. It's also referred to in its Chinese pinyin in some English-speaking circles. And so while I was training quite intensely with the teacher in Chicago, who I mentioned before, who prefers not to be referred to by his name anyone could find him with, but his Taoist name is Xuan Wei. In that time, I was regularly at home practicing a mix of Qi Gong, standing, and seated meditation. And one day in the summer of 2006, I was doing standing meditation quite late at night in a sort of classic tree-hugging posture. And I began to feel this strange feeling like my arms wanted to spin in circles, which I'm kind of showing for anybody who's watching the video, but just my arms just wanted to spin in small circles. And I felt that this was very strange. I had really no prior knowledge about the world of Qigong and self-cultivation. I'd never heard of anything like Zifa Gong, and I'd never been to or seen and was barely aware of things like people speaking in tongues and catching the Holy Ghost, which is a part of American culture. I had just never been exposed to it. So I'd really never seen spontaneous movement in the human body. And I thought, this is awfully odd, because every time I stand in this posture, I feel like my arms really want to do this. So eventually I went to my teacher, Xuan Wei, and asked him what's going on. And he's just like, that's Zifago. And he explained it to me. And I said, okay, so what do you do? And he said, well, you just kind of ride out the storm, because the general sort of sober, wise consensus in Taoist practice about Zifa Gong, with, of course, there being a variety of opinions and some people who take a very different stance. But generally speaking, a lot of people emphasize this can arise naturally. It can also be kind of triggered in the sense that a teacher can intentionally lead a student towards it. And some teachers even will open courses where they're trying to teach people how to get into that state. I've seen such a course in Taiwan. There's even books about it in Chinese. But sometimes it arises totally on its own. For example, as Goenko was talking about with his student. And that when this happens, it's a process of the qi of the body, according to its own innate natural wisdom, balancing itself, for potentially pushing out qi that is not really healthy for the body, and moving from a state of disharmony towards harmony, and from poorer health towards better health through this this process, which can leave a person, it can range from several months to several years. But generally, I think, not having done any formal survey of it, but I think it's generally sort of thought, maybe 2 to 3 years would be the upper limit, generally speaking. Although some approaches to practice, people attempt to continue to go into this spontaneous gong state, perhaps as their primary practice, for a very, very long time. So it's not to say that 2-3 years and it's over, but at any rate, that process spontaneously began for me in 2006. And my teacher's advice was to just kind of ride it out. And it so happened that it started shortly before he began a 3-week intensive, where we were gathering in a Unitarian church 6 days of the week for 3 weeks, and we would have at least an hour of standing meditation in the morning under his watchful eye, and it that was great because it allowed me to sort of, with a sense of safety and trust, to allow things to come out. And this church was pretty much empty, save for us at these hours. And I began to have really intense reactions, like hitting myself. This is a normal part of Qi Gong for a lot of people. It's sort of like tapping, but it can be forceful. It can be really forceful. Coughing, like just really dramatic coughing, like the body's really trying to move something out to the point that I was drooling out, of tears coming out of my eyes. I don't know if I said or not, but like screaming, like, and I'm talking like screaming in a very scary, very loud way that, you know, it would freak a passerby out. But I've seen this sort of thing happen in other contexts, in other, you know, later in my life. For example, in 2017 and 2018, I attended some myofascial release courses taught by John Barnes in the US, where he was getting you know, groups of 100 people in a hotel in New York City to learn how to go into sort of what he would refer to as spontaneous fascial reactions, which are very similar in terms of what you see people doing, like really, really letting loose. And my teacher, Xian Wei, when I would ask him, you know, he would say he was aware I had quite a lot of things happen to me in my life that I was holding in. Some very, very negative interpersonal relationships had left me carrying some serious baggage and some serious scars, in addition to things I talked about in the previous podcast. So he was aware of this. We talked about it, and he also said, from what he was able to discern, some of the things coming out, what he said were very old Qi. And so in this 3-week period, I just kind of got used to witnessing my body go into a very strange, convulsive, purgative state, and allowing that to unfold. And my teacher had his refrain was a sort of very classical Taoist teaching, but I think other traditions have something very similar too. It's just what comes, you know, don't go seeking for it. Allow it to arise, allow it to run its course. And then when it has, you know, when it's time to close the session, sort of come back to normality, and don't linger on sort of trying to intellectualize or capture what just happened, you know, just let it go. And I think that was a very good teaching. And I think it's a great teaching, you know, for meditation practice in general. But I perhaps took it a little bit too far unknowingly later on. So after this 3-week period, I think the Qi Gong maybe reached a crescendo in terms of its just like extreme sort of screaming and purging. And it got so bad that in this room full of 40 students or so, they eventually put me in another room in the church so I wouldn't disturb everybody from the volume of it. Not that people were scared. A lot of them had been practicing for a long time and they'd seen some pretty weird reactions. But it was so loud. And then it began to sort of calm down a little bit. And so then that was around, it would have been July of 2006. And then in August or so, I moved to Connecticut, where my parents had moved to a pretty rural area, and were living literally on the edge of a large tract of forest that was water catchment. I think it's called land, water catchment. I'm sorry, land, and it was therefore undeveloped, unpopulated, and it was the first time in my life I lived next to anything bigger than a park, like a city park. And so I got used to romping around there in my free time, and it was perfect because I could go into my Qi Gong state and not really worry about getting discovered and freaking people out, as would be an actual concern in a park in Chicago. And so I just continued to let the process unfold. And again, every time when I closed my session, I would just sort of say to myself, all right, just let that go. Whatever arose, let it go, let it go. And everything that had happened to that point at all, from the summer of 2006 going into the autumn and the winter, had all been weird and unprecedented and unlike anything that I had context for understanding in my life prior to then. But something shifted in the period when I was in the woods in Connecticut before I went to New Zealand, and I began to go from just sort of coughing and shouting and tapping meridian sort of things to jumping around doing spontaneous martial arts sort of movements. I wouldn't say that they looked exactly like kung fu or anything, even a dancing sort of movements. And then what I could only call speaking in tongues, like sort of babbling in gibberish, but it sounded, linguistic. And it was, oh, and pulling very strange facial expressions. But it was all fairly bizarre. It's the sort of thing that if anyone caught me on video doing it, I would be very unhappy if it ended up on the internet. And I was always alone except for one time when in the winter of that year, my brother came for Christmas, one of my brothers, and we went on a hike together. And when we were pretty deep in the woods, I paused to do some practice. And he was like, that's pretty freaky, man. That looks pretty weird. And I had gotten in the habit of just telling myself, oh, well, this is probably some sort of spontaneous physiological reaction / Qi reaction that is triggering various centers in my brain, which is making me have these odd movements and voices come out. But at this point, I really actually, even though I was getting into Taoism and Buddhism, I actually really wasn't open to the idea that there was a realm that we call a spiritual world, that there was ghosts, that there were deities, that there were other wandering non-corporeal intelligences of any sort. I still was more or less the sort of, a materialist. I believed we die and then the chemical processes stop, the body rots, the brain is broken, and the mind is therefore over. So it never crossed my mind, to be honest, that, oh, this could be anything other than my own spontaneous, strange reaction. And I never contacted via email the teacher I just mentioned, Xuanwei, because I just sort of felt like his instruction was very clear. It comes, let it go. It comes, let him go. In terms of these phenomena. Yeah, I should stop there, let you see if you have any questions or anything.
Was there any emotional or inner visual or auditory content associated with that experience? For example, thoughts, images,
No,
voices, or emotional content, etc.?
not really. No. I mean, like maybe a bit of emotion would sometimes feel to be stirred up, but not really. One thing that I remember was I felt extremely powerful when those sort of martial movements came up, as though I was full of an unusual amount of strength and energy. And I would have this very strong sensation that were I to actually get into a fight, that I would be stronger. Now, this could be a total illusion. Thank God I never tested it. But that was a strong sensation. And another thing that was very interesting that happened during this period is I injured my wrist one day at IKEA. I was working in IKEA at the time, and I was just pushing some stuff back onto a warehouse shelf. And I hit it with a funny angle, and I bent my wrist back, and I got this very painful wrist sprain. And my wrist the next day was so weak that my mom, I remember she handed me a bag with 2 pairs of jeans that one of the other of us had just bought, and I dropped it. I couldn't hold it. My wrist was in so much pain, and I was quite frustrated because I felt, oh, this is going to be weeks before this gets better. And I guess that night or the next, I happened to be in the house alone. So I didn't bother to go into the woods. I did my my standing, which then led it very quickly into Qi Gong alone. And then I ended up doing this circular dance around the living room, totally spontaneous, with a chant, a sort of musical brief chant. And this, I would guess, went on for maybe about 40 minutes or so, something like that. 30 minutes, it could have been an hour. And when I was done, my wrist was entirely healed. Like just, I was very surprised because I've sprained stuff a lot. I'm a pretty active person. And I was like, this is not normal to have a sprain where this morning or yesterday, I couldn't even hold a bag with 2 pairs of pants. And today it's just better. And then, that was interesting. But I got to be honest, I enjoyed this sort of feeling, while my mind is unclear to what degree I was actually getting some sort of power boost. It felt like I was, and I liked that. And I again, I never mentioned any of this to anybody. The only person who, my brother saw me once, and he's pretty used to me being a weird guy. But even for him, it's like, yo, what are you doing in the woods? Yes, that was about that.
Or implying, it seems, that you've become so used to compartmentalizing that as
Hmm.
part of your practice, and then when the practice finishes, letting it go and moving on, that
Yeah,
perhaps there was something building that you were not examining or alert to
exactly.
that you otherwise would.
Exactly. That is my implication. Yep. And on my way to China and then New Zealand, so I saved up some money working at IKEA until January of 2007. Then I visited some family in Ireland, and then I visited a close college friend who at that time was working in Paris. Uh, and I have this very vivid memory of sitting on a metro of some sort in Paris. I can't remember if it was a subway, some sort of metro train. Um, and I was face to face with an older woman, and she had the most gnarled knuckles. And I had this, to be honest, this spontaneous like insight, as though I was seeing into her knuckles and that there was a sort of a grayish goo accumulated on them. And using my mind, I began to, just staring at her knuckles, using my mind, kind of remove this stuff. And in my mind, as I was doing this, I was just kind of, in a way, sort of playing a game, I guess. It's, in a sense of what I would do if I could help this person. And I sat there doing this quite focused for a while. And then I looked up, and she was staring at me incredibly intently, and tears were just streaming down her face, which they had not been before. And I think we could return to this much later in this conversation, but I would say that was because I did not have that sort of ability prior, and I do not now. But things began to happen that were a little bit, I guess you could say, uncanny and unusual. Again, leaving the possibility that this woman was just crying for some other reason, or but she was really staring at me. And then, I visited China. One of my very good friends was there for several weeks, and then I ended up down in New Zealand. This would be, maybe March of 2007. Yeah. So, quite early in my arrival in New Zealand, one of the first things I started to do was look for a Qi Gong class, because I had, in the months, almost a year prior to showing up in New Zealand, had reaped so much benefits from having that kind of community in my life, that discipline. My health was improving, my mental health was improving, my tendency to involve myself in self-destructive behaviors and sort of spiraling thinking. All of these things had improved so much that it just seemed like, okay, one of the first things I should do is try to find a Qigong class and keep up with that, because I did feel like it wasn't like I had learned enough to just continue on my own indefinitely. So I asked around, and I ended up being directed to, I think it is called the New Zealand College of Acupuncture, or Oriental Medicine, something like that, is in Auckland. People said there was an evening Tai Chi and Qigong class there taught by a practitioner of Chinese medicine. So I figured out when that was, and I showed up for a Qigong course. And, the instructor was very welcoming and just sort of like, pay you. It was very inexpensive, maybe $5 at the time, or 10, something like that. And just, pay a few bucks and sure, join us, Qigong class. And at some point late in the class, on the first session, he had us break into pairs and do some sort of a partner Qigong exchange. Just something very subtle. It's not like we were shooting bolts of healing energy out of our hands, just a sort of subtle feeling other people's energy fields and feeling the way in which you can very softly interact with that with another person. And very quickly, my body began to spasm quite a bit. Often when I was doing standing meditation and Qi Gong would begin, I would start to shake and vibrate. And that was coming out, but I had a degree of control over it. So it's not like I was going into full-on screaming in the church mode that I had been in the summer of 2006, because these were strangers. I didn't need to freak them out right away. But I remember the man who I was working with looked a little bit unnerved and kept making eye contact with the teacher. And the teacher, he walked over and he said, to the man, it's fine. Don't worry, the shaking, sometimes people have spontaneous reactions to Qi depending on their sensitivity and their physical constitution and so forth. Don't worry. And so that made me happy, because that just sort of aligned with my general understanding. Yeah, I just have a shaky Qi body. And so class ended, and this teacher came up to me and he said, that shaking actually is not that normal. Why don't you come to my acupuncture clinic this week sometime, and I'll see if I can help you sort it out. And so I said thank you and nodded. And immediately my first thought was, this guy thinks I'm a sucker. He thinks I'm gonna come pay him, $10 for Qi Gong class, and now I'm about to shell out $50 for acupuncture? No way. I'm fine. But I was really like, this is over the top. This is the hard sell. I've been here one day and you're already trying to get me in the clinic. I see how it is. So I just politely said I'd think about it, but I did not go. I didn't even look into his clinic. And the next week, I went back to Qi Gong class though, and things unfolded much as they had the week before. And after class, he came up to me, the teacher, and he said, why didn't you come to my clinic? And I felt a little bit sheepish, and I said, I just moved here to New Zealand, and I spent a lot of money before I came here, and I haven't found a job yet. So I really don't think I have enough money for acupuncture and so forth, herbs and all that. I can't afford it, but I'll think about it. And he said, no, this isn't something for money. I don't want any money from you for this. This isn't an issue that I put in the category of the kinds of things I would accept money to treat, which I thought was a very unusual and surprising comment. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, that shaking that's happening when you're doing Qigong, I don't think it's entirely you. And I was like, that's an enigmatic statement, especially for a guy coming from the kind of background I did, where people never, ever, ever talked about ghosts or even God. Like, I came from pretty much a close to atheist household with, for various reasons, a almost sort of anti-religious bent. And I certainly looked down, I might have mentioned this before, on religious people. I thought that was stupid. So I was like, not me. I didn't even know what he meant. But I could tell he was very sincere and very serious about treating me for free, that he felt that this was important. So he gave me, he told me how to find his clinic. And he said, come, I can't remember what day, but he said, come at night. And I just thought, oh, okay, he's just having me come outside of, normal office hours, because he's not going to charge me. So I thought, all right. And so that when the day came, I found this place, and it was quite in a sort of commercial industrial area of Auckland. It wasn't a residential area, and there weren't shops around. It was pretty industrial. I had to cross a highway overpass to get there, and it was sort of like a row of, it might have been the sort of place where you could come and buy paint during the day, and then his clinic was there. And I show up, and his light's on, and I open the door, and it's kind of funny. I open the door, and from what I understand, I am hit with a massive cloud of marijuana smoke. And I'm like, I should leave now. This guy has just hit the biggest bong ever. And then I thought, I have a lot of friends in Chicago who get high before work. I've worked with guys who smoke a joint before waiting tables for 8 hours. And, guys who go lift weights high. So I was like, it's very possible his Chinese medicine skills improve when he's blazed out of his mind. So after a little bit of mental gymnastics, I decided I would brave the cloud and go in. Much later, I learned this is moxibustion, which, you know, smells a little bit like some very skunky weed. But in my mind, this man is probably like very high. And when he greeted me and his fiance was, I was quite impressed. Like, they've got it together for how much they've been smoking. So, which just proved that he's a Taoist master, you know, because it couldn't affect him. But it was moxibustion. So then he took me into one of the clinical rooms, and it made me feel quite at ease that his fiance was there. The whole situation actually seemed like sort of more normal. Like I'm in this sort of industrial park at night in a random TCM clinic with a person I've met twice who, yeah, it was like, all right, there's somebody else here, it's okay. And we go into one of the treatment rooms, and I said, so I didn't really understand what you said the other day about it not being me. And he said, all right, well, when things like this come up, I usually tell people I give them a choice. I can give you a very simple, superficial explanation if you don't want to know too much and you're not interested in these things, then we'll just try to get on with the treatment. Or I can just tell you everything I can tell you. It depends on how much you would like to know. And I be the nature of my personality, I said, well, of course, I would like to know everything you have to say. And he said, all right, well, in addition to my studies of Chinese medicine, Tai Chi, and Qi Gong, I have also, since becoming a practitioner of TCM, begun to study with two Māori healers. He is also Pakeha, but he was studying with two Māori healers, and they were teaching him about how to remove entities. And what he was learning with these two Māori teachers of his was how to sense, sometimes even see, and then how to remove beings inhabiting a person's body which should not be there. And at this point, I mean, I was just sort of like, what the hell am I hearing? This is the first time in my life. The only other exorcism I had ever heard of in my life prior to that, outside of the movies, was a gay friend of mine from the South who went back south for summer vacation. And he was Southern Baptist, and his parents and relatives forced him to go through like an attempt to take the gay ghost out of him, which also another mutual friend was sort of compelled to witness, which they all found it to be a very disturbing and ridiculous ritual and kind of hurtful. And it didn't work. Actually, he went from being in the closet to totally like, you know what, I'm out after that. So in my mind, exorcism was kind of like a preposterous notion. And here I'm having a person tell me that I might have something in me, and I'm like, what? But it is very much an aspect of my personality to like learn by getting bruises, learn by jumping into things. Sometimes, you know, learn that I'm not interested in something, but always if there's an opportunity to do something new, I tend towards taking it. And I'm like, okay, so then what do we do next? And I was a little bit creeped out, and I had a little bit of a goosebump feeling because I felt that the man talking to me, by this point, I no longer felt like I was talking to a high person. Like I felt like I was talking to a person who knew what they were talking about and was pretty serious. And the fact that he didn't want my money, just his presence had sincerity and calm. And, you know, I didn't feel like I was talking to a madman. I said, well, what do we do next? And he said, oh, well, don't worry. It's actually not that big of a deal. This does happen a fair amount. And traditional cultures around the world have generally had ways of dealing with this. The modern scientific West is kind of more of an aberration in that we don't acknowledge these things, and that therefore we have no idea what to do. but actually this is just a part of the fabric of human existence and always has been. And the Maori population of New Zealand has kept this knowledge alive and has been so kind to share it with me. So I'll get rid of it. Sort of, this will be easy. So he had me take my shoes off and lie down face up on the treatment table, that you'd see in any acupuncture clinic. And he placed a chair at the foot of the table. And he sat there, so he was facing my bare feet. And he said, okay, we're going to begin. I'm just going to sort of connect with your body and I will remove this thing. And I said, okay, sure. So he gently put he clasped my 2 feet. So, his fingers were on the tops of my feet. And then his thumbs touched the center of the ball of, I guess more or less the center of the arch near to the ball of the foot, kind of around the Yongquan kidney 1 point in acupuncture. Maybe it was that point. And much to my shock, the moment he made contact, my body just went into utterly, like, instantaneous convulsions, spasms. I began to writhe around, not unlike, a person reenacting scenes from the film The Exorcist. Yes, and and immediately I understood, oh, this is why this man asked me to come here at night, because I was screaming, I was crying. But it was different in character from the Qi Gong in that church, 8 or 9 months earlier, because here I did instantly have a sense of, like, this is very strange. I seem to be witnessing my body, not that I have lost total control of it, but I seem to be witnessing something I don't recognize, causing my body to move and react. It felt different, and the whole affair lasted quite a long time. It could have been an hour, and at some point, I felt as though I was going to attempt to hit this man, and I had to use all of my force of will to control my body from sitting up and attempting to punch him. And I felt that attempting to punch him was not my own desire or my own intention, and that I was fighting against that. Yeah, again, I should pause and take a breath, but also see if you have any questions.
For the entire duration of the session, he remained in that posture, in that position?
Yes.
Or
He never moved. He never moved.
Did he tell you what he was doing from his side, other than making contact?
Not really, but when we finished, and it ended the moment he broke contact with my feet. I just sort of, I was already lying down, but so to speak, I collapsed. Well, I hadn't only been lying down, I'd been writhing, I'd been hissing, coughing, crying, etc. Then I just lay there in a heap, utterly drained and spent in a very deep way. And I said, but my body movements and all the noise stopped the moment he broke contact with my feet. And I thought, oh, we're done. And I said, so it's finished, right? And he said, no, I hate to tell you it's not. And I'm just like, what? And he says, I have never encountered one quite as powerful and intelligent as what you have. It knows how to hide from me. We've never had a conversation about what exactly that meant. And I don't know if we ever will. It's not somebody I've stayed in close contact with. And it's also not, I don't feel it's my path to learn this art. So I'm not sure what his experience from his standpoint would have been, but I remember very clearly what his assessment. Yeah.
So what happened next? Did he offer further treatment? Did he wish to refer you to his own teachers, for example? What was the next step?
Yeah, so he said he was clear that this was beyond his ken to treat. But he was also very calm about it. Meanwhile, I was going through something I don't know if you call it an identity crisis, an epistemological crisis. Like, wait a second, I may have to reassess my some of my notions about what life is and how many eyes there can be in one body. Like, there was a lot for me to process, and also just witnessing my own body react like this was very different from Qi Gong, which is already new to me and very different. People they don't teach you that in American public schools, Qi Gong. Now it's like I'm in a whole nother realm of weird has just cracked open in front of me. But he was very calm, and he said, but don't worry, there are actually plenty of other exorcists that I know in Auckland. Now, he said, typically, ideally, he would immediately just take me to meet his Māori teachers. But he said one of them, she's just kind of a very free spirit, and she would just kind of disappear for lengths of time and not leave any contact details, and he wouldn't know where she was or how to get in contact. And when she was back, she was back, and when she was gone, she was gone. And his other Maori teacher was under taboo because her father, I believe, had passed away. And according to tradition, as the tradition she observed, she was not allowed to do any healing work. I believe it was for a year. And he said, but not to worry, I know some other exorcists. I guess I don't know if this phenomenon replicates in other cities, in other countries, but it stands to reason maybe in any city around the world that these people kind of end up on a grapevine and potentially establish, professional relationships, just like, acupuncturists would or yoga teachers. It's just that this is a pretty underground thing, at least in a lot of the Western world, I think. Maybe not Memphis and other places in the South, because I know there's a lot of exorcism in some Christian communities. But anyway, we were in New Zealand at the time, and he said he knew two Catholics who he would take me to, that he considered them very accomplished and very skillful. So we set a time for that. I think it might have been about 2 weeks later or something like that. And by that time I'd gotten a job, and he picked me up in his car in the evening, and we drove to meet these two Catholic exorcists who are not priests. They're actually lay people. At the time, late middle-aged couple, husband and wife. And we went to like a very suburban sort of area of Auckland. And it was kind of funny because I'm expecting, we're going to meet Catholic exorcists. I'm expecting frock, stained glass windows, frankincense. And we end up with this, like, an American would call it like a bungalow. It's a very suburban house. What? And then we knock on the door, and this couple who honestly looked like what you would expect Mr. Rogers and his wife to be in the flesh. And their home is just immaculate. They had white carpet. Now, I don't even dare to wear white shirts, white carpet. And there's it was very tasteful, and, quite a lot of crucifixes and oil paintings around, and just clearly the home of some like solid church-going folks, and very warm, welcoming, and gentle people. And just so straight-laced. I'm like, what's your exorcist? Where's your pentagram, man? Where's the cloak? So, but anyway, they led me into their sitting room, and we sat down to sort of, the fellow who I've just been describing, the TCM practitioner, he's the only person out of this whole story that I've remained in contact with, and he's asked to not be named. He says that this kind of service is something that he only provides, in Chinese people say yuanfen, like this just almost like chance, a mix of chance and destiny, right? Like, it's not like he's hung his shingle out, I am an exorcist. And I think for this couple, it was quite a similar thing as well. But this fellow who had worked on me the first time, he told them everything that had happened and how he came to sense it. Then they asked me to sort of, say how all this stuff started. So everything I've told you so far, I told them, and I was, still quite mystified. And I said, I'm curious. Do you all think this is real? You agree that with him that I have some sort of an entity, a ghost, something? And they said, oh yeah, we can sense it. We do sometimes get people who it's in their minds. Maybe they're too into vampire novels and horror movies, or they just gotten carried away, or maybe they actually have a mental illness. But we had, through the grace of God, sometime in middle age, a spontaneous sort of awakening, I guess, where we were touched and chosen to provide this service. And then we gained through this a set of abilities that were granted to us by God. Or I don't know if they said God or Jesus, but granted to them in this way. And among the abilities is to sense if somebody's carrying such an attachment. And they said, no, for sure, in our minds, we can tell you have one. So after quite a long conversation, they said they would begin, and it was agreed that the first fellow, that the TCM physician, would actually be on hand to kind of hold me down, because he informed them that this thing was quite strong and violent. And he happens to have been a former soldier. He's a very strong, very large individual, a very tough person. So it was not hard for him to hold me down physically. And they got to laying hands on me, the couple, laying hands on me and praying aloud, just praying over and over again. And it was very similar. The moment I was touched, this series of very, very extreme reactions exploded out of me. And they also, for a very long period of time, just sort of knelt on the ground next to me, with their hands on me, praying and praying and praying and praying and praying. And I'm there hissing and writhing around and pulling these awful grimaces and hacking. And also, to be honest, having my own sort of psychological subtext going on as well, because I was kind of like, this is very Christian, and I am not Christian. This is very weird. And at some point, quite a lot of time had passed. Then I began to speak in a high-pitched, very creepy voice in English. So, something kind of horror movie-like, I would say, even though I don't watch a lot of horror movies, but just kept in this mocking, high-pitched, squealing voice as they're invoking Jesus over and over and over again. Just start to say, just sort of like, who is your Jesus? And then, ha, 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 just laughing and laughing. That was the only time in this entire multi-month ordeal that there was any English that came out of my mouth. But it sort of conversed with them, and they were going back and forth with it. And I remember there's like, out dancing spirit, because I told them about that dance that healed my wrist and things like that. And then they began to anoint my forehead with crosses that they made with some kind of oil that they had. And they asked me to ask for help from Jesus, which I was not prone to do at first, because it felt too much like sort of an initiation to a religion that I'm not a part of. But things got so freaky that I just, at that point, was like, I am ready for Jesus's help. I'm ready for anybody's help. And I did, out loud, using my own voice, of course, ask for Jesus's help. And this is a long, long time ago, so I don't remember exactly what point it ended, but at some point I just sort of fell, again, utterly exhausted and tired. And the ordeal stopped, and I was sort of helped back onto the couch, and the three of them agreed that it had been removed, and that I would be okay. And so, yeah, actually, quite honestly, then we had tea and Tim Tam biscuits and talked for a while, and they just sort of, advised me to let it go, don't linger on these things. By no means play around with any sort of black magic or occult stuff. Just stay away from all that and walk the straight and narrow path. And they didn't want me to become Catholics. Then they thought that I was doing Qi Gong with this other fellow was perfectly fine, but just stay away from the occult. And you know, after 30 minutes of chatting and Tim Tams and tea, we said goodbye, and I got a ride home. Yeah. So that's sort of chapter 2, I guess.
Tim Tams and Jesus. They do
It's
love
a great combination.
They do love their Tim Tams.
Yes.
Part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, remarkable. I'm curious about your own state of mind at this point. As you said, it was quite a challenge to your worldview, materialistic worldview and so on. And, well, now they've told you it's over. Were you able to forget about it and move on, or did you have to continue to reckon with this challenge to your worldview? And then, of course, because there are further chapters, I assume it wasn't successful, actually, this exorcism. So
right, it was
what
not.
happened? Yeah, what happened next?
I think mentally, I mean, I was still 23. I still had a lot of neuroplasticity. I have none left anymore. And what else? I mean, you know, I had dove into this interest in meditation quite voraciously when I started, you know, and even, you know, I started to read some spiritual books at least a year and a half before all of this. And so by the time this all happened, I had read Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. I had read this book that my other brother had been assigned in college that was lying around the house called Blazing Splendor, I believe, which was an autobiography of a Tibetan Lama who grew up in Tibet. And there's some very occult things in that. I mean, he describes running into a Lama when he was young who had the ability, supposedly, to resurrect corpses as mindless zombies, and that he wandered around Tibet with a zombie who was his manservant slash, well, basically his manservant, carried his stuff. I mean, that book is pretty, there's some out there stuff, unless you grew up in the milieu where that's normal. And I read all of that stuff.
Tulku Urgen, by the way.
Okay, yeah, I really enjoyed that book. But I read parts of it like that. And I have read Open the Dragon Gate about, you know, a Qi Gong master and Chronicles of Tao. I read all of that as sort of like, interesting. But I didn't really, at the time when I was reading it, linger on questions of, is this real or not? But when all this weird stuff started to unfold in my life, having read all of those books, I had a new attitude towards them, which was, oh, maybe some of the wild stuff they were describing is not just stories. That doesn't mean that I went from 0 to believing it's possible to have a zombie manservant. I mean, I still, to be honest, don't have any reason to believe that's possible. You know, I'm not committed to doubting it, and I won't argue with somebody who says they've seen that, but you know, there's a huge spectrum of possibility. But the fact that I've been exposed to this kind of literature, or I've exposed myself to this kind of literature for quite a while already, made me have something of a context for what was unfolding. And at the same time, I had great respect for my teacher in Chicago, and I emailed him about all of this and was kind of half expecting him to say, this is all in your head, man, because he's a pretty sober, staid person, and he was in his you know, very even keel way replied to my emails like, oh yeah, Taoism acknowledges this. This is certainly something that most traditional cultures are aware of. Taoism has much to say about it. At the time when things were unfolding for you in Chicago, I did not sense that you had a ghost or demon active, but it's possible I couldn't sense it. It's possible that something became active in some way or another later, or that it attached to you later. I don't know. He's very conservative about, you know, making proclamations about anything. And he said, but I'm glad you've run into these people. And if their diagnosis is correct, and it sounds like, you know, what was done, what needed to be done was done. And again, now, much as that Catholic couple told you, your responsibility to yourself is to let it go and don't linger on it and just get on with life. And so I think I just kind of took it all on board as, all right, there's more to this universe than I thought. And so I was happy to be able to, return to doing seated and standing meditation. And now I would not have spontaneous movements. They weren't arising, and I could practice Qi Gong as well without any trouble. So something changed. Either something was truly removed, or I had some sort of I was psychologically convinced enough that whatever was going on, that might have all been my imagination, which I offer here to the, dyed-in-the-wool skeptics who might be listening, as because I actually don't want to throw their perspective totally in the garbage either. At any rate, there was a major change in my being that allowed these symptoms to stop for quite a while. And in this time, because I didn't know anybody in Auckland really, I also began to volunteer at a Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition Gelug temple, which I'm very interested in Buddhist teachings. They were offering, there's a geshe in residence there who's Tibetan, grew up in India and had a geshe degree and was the teacher offering a regular series of courses. And there were also pujas that you could attend. And I was having a stressful time just being alone in a new country, and then a major fiasco erupted at work very shortly into my time there, where I was involved in a sort of dispute with the union. I was on, the union was on the side of defending me and a couple of other workers. And I actually had to stop going to work. I was still receiving a paycheck, which is a kind of interesting twist of fate, because as I was undergoing all this stuff, I didn't have to balance this sort of the stress of having to have these weird things going on in my life at night and then show up to work the next day and act like everything is normal. I was actually receiving a paycheck, but I had to stay in Auckland. The union was very strict about that. They said, don't leave, because if they call you in for a meeting at any time and you're off in Queenstown bungee jumping, that's grounds for them to fire you. So you have to be here in case they ever call you in on the drop of a dime. But I actually had 3 whole months of being paid to stay out of work, lest I rabble rouse. But it was not a vacation. I was, a little bit. Actually, I will say there was some anxiety for sure at this point already building by what I had gone through, the weirdness of it, the newness of it, and also being away from friends, away from family, away from familiar surroundings, and having this very toxic work environment that blew up into a full-on, union is here, taking us to, fighting for us sort of thing. There's a lot of stress. And so I spent a lot of time, several days a week at this, I think it was called the Dorje Chang Center, this FPMT temple, just volunteering and taking classes or attending pujas when they had them available. And at some point, I began to have this strange sense, especially when I was doing standing meditation, that intuitively I felt that the being had returned and that it was upset and that it wanted back in to my body and that it was pissed off that it had been sent away. And I began to have this very strong just feeling that it was as though when I was doing standing meditations, this is when it would be very clear, as though I were standing inside of like a circular cage about maybe 4 to 6 meters in diameter and pacing around this circular cage, unable to get in, but wanting to get in, was some sort of malevolent being. It almost felt like being in a cage and having a shark or a hungry tiger circle around it. Just circling and circling because it's a hungry animal, and you're the only thing that looks edible, and it's just going to keep pacing until it finds a way in. And I found that deeply disturbing. And when I began to have that feeling, it was the first time that my mental state really began to be negatively influenced, because I felt real fear. And I went from being a person who had no, I was utterly mentally closed to the possibility of beings that aren't animals or plants, or fungi, to there being formless living things that would get in our forms. I mean, I just like my opinion on that had been turned upside down against my planning and my will very suddenly. And now I was like, well, this thing is back, and I really feel its malevolence. But then again, am I crazy? And if so, then why have I gone crazy? That I am now sensing this sort of thing, because I wasn't sold on the ability on the idea that this, even having met the Catholic exorcists and the TCM doctor trained in Māori exorcism, having, despite their confidence in their skill set and their view of the world, I wasn't sure, and I was like, yeah, maybe I'm going nuts now. And now it's really freaky, because in the beginning it was just kind of other people, they can kind of feel something and I feel fine, but now I feel this darkness. And so, I don't remember the order in which all these things happened, because this is so long ago, but, I wrote an email to the teacher in Chicago, and he was, he said, from where I am, I can't see what's going on. I can't offer you a remote diagnosis. It is possible it's psychological and that you have sort of freaked yourself out. It's also possible that this thing is back. And yeah, I remember he added a comment that typically, as per his knowledge, when malevolent entities were removed from people, they would usually come back for revenge on the exorcist, not on the original host. So he was a little bit surprised about that, but he said, it's up to you to determine if this is your imagination or if this is real, and you're going to have to solve it in New Zealand with the resources you have there. At some point, I went back and found the TCM practitioner / Qi Gong teacher, and he felt that something was off. He felt that it was coming back, and he felt that this was not a good thing, and he felt that this was such a wily and powerful being that it was beyond also. It was probably not something that a second trip to the Catholic exorcist could solve. And he said, I really need to get in touch with my Māori teachers. And he tried to. And the one who had gone off the grid was still off of the grid. And the other one was still on taboo and still not taking, maybe patience is the right word. And he said, just hold tight. And we had determined something by this point, which was that most of the time it didn't have access to my mind and body. It was when I went into a state of some, I guess you would call stillness, practicing Qi Gong or practicing standing or seated meditation, that in other just normal day-to-day activities, whatever door or portal it had something to do with the way that I was opening up, I guess you might say energetically, when going into a relaxed meditative state. And it was taking advantage of that. And so the TCM teacher, TCM physician, Qi Gong teacher, advised me strongly to stop all practice. This is the most important thing for you to do until we can find somebody with the power and expertise. Then you need to stop going into that state, because that opens the door. And I could feel that this was true. And so I did stop. But, okay, I'm getting things a little bit out of order. I didn't stop right away. I think I had more than one conversation with this teacher. Yes, so that part I just said that, I'm sorry, that chronologically is a little bit out of order. Our first conversation, he said he felt that the thing was probably coming back, but it hadn't gotten back in me yet. And so returning to the Tibetan Buddhist center that I was volunteering at, Um, After I became quite familiar with some of the nuns there, who were Westerners, and I'd been volunteering for a while, and we had built something of a rapport, I finally worked up the nerve to ask them about it. And it seemed like a good idea because prior to that point, my very superficial understanding of Buddhism was that Buddhists believe that everything in the universe is a product of the mind. And so I expected what they would tell me is, this is all just your mind. This is not real. And that they might have ways to advise me how to deal with this as a phenomenon of simply my own imagination run wild, or neuroses, anxiety, something in that spectrum. And so when I did raise this with a Kiwi Tibetan Buddhist nun, I was quite surprised that she was like, oh yeah, that happens from time to time. And every now and then somebody will come to see the Geshe who's got a problem like this. If you like, I could arrange for you to have a meeting with him. And I thought that would be a good idea because, and I remember quite clearly, I was honestly hoping he would tell me, all those other non-Buddhists you met are deluded maniacs, and you are developing a mania, and you're going to use Buddhism to deal with it as a purely mental phenomenon. I really expected that's what I was going to hear from this man, because I hadn't really studied Buddhism much, and I knew very little about Tibetan culture, despite having read Blazing Splendor and the fact that, you know, that guy had a zombie pet. I still figured Buddhism was just all about the mind. It's very clean. It's all in here, man. So she, you know, arranged for me to have a meeting on his sort of office hours day. And I went in and I described, he has an interpreter. He doesn't speak fluent English, but he had a live-in interpreter, a Tibetan man who was just an amazing bilingual Buddhist interpreter. And he helped interpret it. And yeah, I told him the kind of the abridged version because he didn't want to listen to this for 2 hours. He was nodding and he was like, yeah, this is real. I said, what? I mean, I was really surprised that a Buddhist would acknowledge this. And I was like, yeah, this is real. You definitely have some sort of, I don't remember what word he used, if it was ghost or demon, and this was through an interpreter, but he was like, you have something and it's not you. But don't worry, I'm going to do a puja right now and it won't be able to bother you again. And so at this point, where this is chronologically, I was still in the state of feeling the thing malevolently pacing around me, but not being able to get close. And so he was sitting on a raised platform about maybe 50 centimeters off the ground with a cushion. He's sitting cross-legged on it. And he had me kneel in front of him with my hands in the prayer posture. And he began to recite, I think it was a mix of mantras and maybe also some longer text. And he had a Vajra bell and I guess just a Vajra, the double-ended. So the bell with the Vajra on top and then the double-ended Vajra. And from time to time, he would ring the bell and then press the double-edged metal Vajra, which is quite small, into the crown of my head. And I would begin to shake violently and spontaneously and hiss, but not quite as intensely as the previous events. And it was quite a short puja, maybe 15 minutes. Then he gave me a sort of a small red satchel on a string to wear around my neck. And it had the Hayagriva, which is a wrathful manifestation of Avalokiteshvara mantras inside. And then he transmitted to me that mantra in particular as a protective mantra and told me to recite it 7 times every night and to wear that protective talisman all the time. And he was adamant, you are fine. Like, this is the power of the Buddha is behind this. You are totally safe now. In fact, he advised me to go back to meditating and not to worry about that feeling of having something pace around me, because I was under the protection of Hayagriva at this point. I guess the next day, or might have even been that afternoon when I got home, it was still, I remember the sun was up when this happened, but it was a gray, cold Auckland day. And I was at home and I decided to go into standing meditation, and no matter what happened, to just probably set an alarm for 40 minutes or something to just do the whole session. And I was, I said the Hayagriba mantra, I was wearing the talisman, and I get this feeling of this malevolence circling me. And I was just, I won't be afraid. I won't give in. I won't, I'll just keep going. And at some point, I don't remember exactly when, I felt that it burst through whatever was surrounding me. And I felt a terrible physical sensation that my entire body became weak and shaky, and it felt like my brain was kind of on fire, like an awful heat. And I fell to the ground in a mix of actual physical discomfort. I mean, it really felt awful, but also terror and kind of anger at myself, because it's like, I really felt, it was a lot of self-recrimination. Like, why are you letting yourself go crazy? What the fuck? Like, this is not, this whole sort of sidetrack, which now is a very interesting story to look back on, but I'm sure anyone who's been through it or is going through something even remotely similar is not enjoying it at the time, and is not thinking, oh, gee, I better take notes because one day this is going to be fun to talk about around the campfire. At the time, I felt like freaked out, terrified both this thing was back and it's totally real and it was going to take control of my mind and body, but also, oh, Jesus, I might be losing my freaking mind and I might be becoming a proper madman. At the same time, I was already developing a stronger affinity for Buddhist and Taoist teachings, and I'd been spending a lot of time in that temple. And I was specifically tasked by a nun with cleaning up a large shrine room dedicated to, Chenrezig Avalokiteshvara, which was also the home, the housed hundreds of small Buddha statues that were, I guess, reliquaries for the ashes and a few bone fragments of deceased faithful of that community. And so I was spending, many hours a week in there, very close to this Avalokiteshvara statue. I believe that was actually a Guanyin statue. Is that it was a Chinese style one that had been donated, and there was also a Bizangwang Pusa is Ksitigarba statue, and I felt as I'm going through this mix of fear, terror actually, and discomfort, but also like, well, I'm just gonna pray, and I just got myself up off the floor and just repeated Avalokiteshvara hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times until my system sort of settled down. But from that moment on, and for the rest of this story, I began to live life in a state of fear and anxiety and confusion. I was freaked out. Up till then, it had all been kind of, this is weird, but all right. But that feeling that this thing was back and had gotten in me, it switched. This is not fun and games at all. This is something very freaky is happening. And it's beyond my ability to control and my ability to understand. And so this takes me back to, I got chronologically out of order. I went back and found the TCM physician, Qi Gong teacher, and he advised me. And I told him what had happened just now with this Tibetan monk. This might have been a week later when I finally went and saw him. And he asked me to demonstrate. He said, well, let me see what happens if you go into a meditative state. And so I stood there in standing meditation, clicked over into that stillness, which anybody, who's been doing meditation for a while knows. You develop that sort of knack to be like, okay, I'm going. And the moment I did, I leapt onto the ground in all fours. And my eyes were bugging out, my tongue was out. And this man, who again, like he was a highly trained soldier, and a big, strong guy. I remember he took a step back and had a look of fear in his eyes. And he's like, stop, 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 stop. And I stood back up because I still had the ability to turn it off. All I had to do was click out of the meditative state. And I was in control. And I remember he said, that was pretty psycho. And he looked and he just said, you have to stop meditating. I'm going to find a way to get in touch, get you treated by my Maori teacher, but you might have to wait for quite a while because of the taboo that she's under. So just don't meditate, don't do Qi Gong. Try to stay sane. I mean, he was very sympathetic. He felt like, I can't speak for him, but I think he perhaps felt like this was his responsibility to some extent, that he had kind of taken up this case and hadn't been able to resolve it. And I was left in a bit of a lurch. Not that he wasn't the initial cause, but he definitely wanted to see it through and had reached an impasse where he couldn't do it by the means available to him at that time. And I think he knew or could sense that I was, this was rough. I just had to tough this out on my own. And that I was in this period of away from home, in that union debacle at work. I had a hell of a lot of time to myself. And so I basically just every day started to go to the library a lot, read a lot of books, take long walks all over Auckland, volunteer a lot. And as you can imagine, at some point, I began to think maybe I should tell my family about this. So I called long distance to tell my mother, and needless to say, she is not a witch. She did not have any idea what to say about this. And having her son call her up to talk about this stuff, obviously I did not give her the full rundown of everything, but I kind of glossed onto like, hey, I might be having a spiritual crisis, or I might be going insane. I think I should fill you in. It freaked her out, I'm sure. And I didn't walk away from that conversation thinking like I should further burden my mother with this, because A, she can't do anything for me, and B, this just sounds like that's a hell of a weird phone call to get from a kid, I would imagine. So I felt very alone, and I didn't have friends really around the world who I knew how to go to them looking for a shoulder to lean on for the same reason. It's just kind of like, hey, man, you sound crazy. And so I began a stage of really being very lonely, to be honest, or very isolated. And as the weeks went on and eventually turned into months, because everything I've just described so far, I think, took place within the span of a month or so. But subsequently, things dragged out for a very long time, maybe close to 3 months. I began to get physically weaker and weaker, at the same time as having a voracious appetite. And I began to eat enough for 2 of me all the time, every day. And I would get these enormous cravings, for example, for candy. And I would like go buy these huge king-size candy bars, but I was losing weight all along. It was like I had a parasite. My skin became very white. I had one photo of me taken in this period. I remember my lips were colorless. And I would become very easily exhausted. Like walking up a single flight of stairs would leave me panting. And the amount of time that I could be awake during the day was progressively shortening. And I also, as time had really worn on, maybe 2 months into this, as I was feeling weaker and weaker and weaker, I began to feel that I no longer necessarily needed to be in a meditative state for this thing to assert itself and try to influence my body, and rather that simply being tired seemed to be a potential avenue for it, and that I needed to maintain a vigilance at all times, which was exhausting. And I remember also, like in the evenings, I would be alone at home reading, because I didn't have a TV. I hadn't been planning to stay in that apartment for a long time, and I was going through that early spiritual practitioner phase where it's like I'll definitely become a Buddha faster if I don't own any TV, which might be true actually. But so I'd be at home reading, and I began to sense that I could see, because you asked a while earlier, like, was I seeing anything? I hadn't prior, but I was starting to see sort of floaty things in my room out of the corner of my eye, and I would always look over and I would wonder, is it somehow the light catching in my eyelashes or something? And whenever I would look directly at whatever I was sensing, I wouldn't see anything. But then I'd go back to reading, and I would again sense this movement in the middle of my living room area. Well, it was a studio apartment. It was also my bedroom. So it just so happened, actually, that, funny enough, I was in this neighborhood, Parnell, and I lived walking distance from this church of Spiritualism, which is this American phenomenon that developed after the Civil War, when people were looking to communicate often with family members who died in that war, of which there's a tremendous amount of death, and people were experimenting with seances and maybe other forms of spiritual communication with the deceased, mediumship as well. And it turned into some sort of an institution where they had a church of spiritualism there in Auckland, and I kept walking by it. And one day I Googled them to figure out what that was, and I thought, well, these people might have something to offer me. So I found out that they had maybe like a Thursday evening open sort of event, and I went there, and I won't describe the whole spiritualist service other than to say it's sort of like based on Christianity. So they have reworded various traditional hymns, which is quite interesting. And then later in the evening, a woman took to the pulpit, I guess you would say, the equivalent of a pulpit. She was a medium to deliver messages from the spiritual world for people in the pews, or the seats, if they wanted to hear them. And as soon as she got up there, she pointed at me and said, I have a message from some beings. If you would like me to share it with you, I will. And I said, yes, please do. And she said, oh, these ghosts come to your house in the evening, and they know that you can see them. They want to tell you not to be afraid. They like you. And I got really big goosebumps, because I thought, like, that's all. I am definitely having that experience. Let's try to remember if there's time to talk about that sort of phenomenon later on. Anyway, because Chinese medicine and Taoism has something to say about that sort of thing. But anyway, I walked out of the Spiritualist Society's evening event thinking, oh, they really might be able to help me. They seem to have some sort of capabilities there. So I went back another couple of times, and they said that they were doing a sort of a healing thing after the services, where there was a back room, and 3 or 4 of their more experienced practitioners were going to be in there and I remember the lights were very dim. They would do laying of hands to heal people, and it could be any kind of affliction. So I went and introduced myself outside of that room and said I was having some weird things going on, and just, mentioned the gist of it and would they be able to help. And they said, oh, certainly we could. So I put my name on the list and waited for them to call my name. And when my turn came, I went in there, and they had me sit down and told me to relax. And I can't remember exactly how many individuals it was, 3, maybe 4. And they laid hands on me, and immediately pandemonium. And they stopped right away, and they were basically like, whoa, 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 dude, not cool. We're done. We're not working with you. That was interesting. They were like, nope, out of the room. We don't deal with this stuff. And no explanation. They didn't even want to talk about it. In fact, to be entirely honest, I felt that I was not welcome anymore after that. And I don't say that in any sort of like a resentful way. I say more in a sense that they were like, that's some bad mojo with that dude, and we don't need him around here, which only sort of, I will be honest, increased my despondence, because now I was like, it seems like everybody who's got an ounce of spirituality in them agrees that something is severely wrong with me. And, as I'm weakening and I'm feeling that this thing is waiting for my energy levels to get so low that it can just pounce and really take the steering wheel, so to speak, that I may end up doing something horrific this body may end up doing something horrific. And what I am likely to experience in the near future is commitment, involuntary commitment to a mental institution, and probably heavy doses of antipsychotic drugs. Or even worse, I actually go do something horrible and then get that. Or maybe I should consider taking the first step, and maybe I'll have no choice but to end my own life. Not that I was not strongly suicidal, but these dark thoughts were beginning to gather in my mind as a long period of time was going on, and my health was a mess. And then one day, I'm trying to think, have I left anything else? I hope I'm not skipping anything. I think that's more or less it. One day I get a phone call from the TCM doctor, and he says, I've got great news. My Māori teacher has said that she's going to break the taboo to treat you, and we're going to do it in the very near future. So I'm going to arrange a time with her, and we'll do it. And I'll come pick you up when the time comes, and we're going to go and do it in the ocean. And then he said something quite interesting. He said, I don't remember his exact words, but he said, the Maori culture is very close to the sea. It's always been very close to the sea. If anyone knows much about Maori culture, I mean, they actually descended from the same people who were indigenous population in Taiwan. And they got to Hawaii, to New Zealand, and so forth on massive canoes. This is truly an oceanic culture. And he said, so we will be doing this ritual in the ocean. And so you're going to be in the water. And I said, oh, okay, well, sure. At this point, nothing could weird me out anymore. That's one thing I have to say. I developed a very thick skin. Like, nothing's weird. So, all right, yeah, sure. So, yeah, the long and short of it was wear a swimsuit. And so, I don't know, maybe a week or two passed, and he picked me up on, I think it was a Saturday morning, early-ish. And it was another miserable slate gray sky, cold rain, Auckland winter day. And we drove down to a beach not far from downtown, but not a really populous beach, especially in that season. But there were cars, in the distance driving by, cyclists on a bike path, joggers, but not a huge number of people, it being the morning and it being a rainy day. And we got out after parking his car, and we waited, and eventually, within 10 minutes, another car pulled up nearby, and a middle-aged Maori woman got out, who, like all these other exorcists, except for the Tibetan Buddhist geshe, was not wearing any magician clothes, and wouldn't have caused you to skip a beat in a supermarket, just would look like any other mother shopping for groceries. Totally normal woman. Wearing I believe it was there's this thing in New Zealand, it's Ford and Holden, these two car companies, the people who are into racing like one or the other. And I think she was a Ford woman. And if she ever hears this and I'm wrong, I will get an ass beating one day. But that was notable. She's wearing like a racing jacket. And she just seemed so normal. But there was this utter warmth and love emanating from this woman's eyes. And a confidence and a presence, I would say, evidence of like a true spiritual path walked with, realness for years, both on the inside and the outside, in her mind and in her service in the world. And I felt the love coming off of her, and I felt a calm and a safety in this woman's presence instantaneously. And she just walked up and introduced herself in the most simple of terms, and then said, she hugged me, but then she also said, in Maori culture, we have a greeting where we press the tips of the noses and then the center of our foreheads together, and I want to do that with you, partly because it's our greeting, but also because it's a way of exchanging information, and I will get to know you and know more about you by doing this. Can we? And we did. And I just felt great trust in this person. So then we walked the short distance to the beach, and she had me strip down to my my swim trunks, and we put the clothes. I can't remember. We put the clothes somewhere to keep them dry. And she took off her shoes. She said it was very important that she be barefoot. And then the TCM practitioner, he as well, he stripped down into sort of like a spandex, sort of like, like sort of like surfing shirt, you know what I mean? Like that sort of, that's was like a rash guard shirt, I think it's called. And his swim trunks. And she said, they gave me a brief rundown of what was going to happen. And they said, the Maori understanding of these things is that sometimes a being that we might call a demon can inhabit a human body. And in order to get rid of it, the person has to be brought very close to death. And at that time, the body becomes energetically inhospitable, literally uninhabitable for spirit. Spirit cannot remain living in dying flesh, or dead. It can't live in dead flesh. Blazing splendor aside, and that we will use the drowning process, or bringing you close to it, to trigger that. And then at the moment when spirit begins to leave flesh, the unwelcome being will be escorted away, and I will be put back. And again, that TCM doctor used to be a soldier. He's a very strong guy, very big guy, much stronger than me. So it was his job to do the holding me under the water. And she said, are you willing to do this? I understand this is might sound quite scary, and it's a huge thing to commit to. And there's a term in Chinese which is 司马当活马医, which is when you've got a dead horse, you can treat it like it's still alive and try to give it some medicine, which just kind of means like you're at wit's end and nothing's working, and it's just kind of like, well, fuck it, we'll try this. And that's what my attitude was, because I actually didn't feel afraid. I was already in so much fear that I was like, whatever, this is probably going to be fine. And also, what I'm more afraid of is ending up in a mental institution. And I'm willing to do anything that I can to try to avoid that. And I don't think Western medicine has anything to offer me. Like, I feel like this is the only shot I've got right now. Otherwise, I'm teetering on the brink of insanity of some sort. And so I readily acceded to this, and we walked out to about chest deep water, and which meant we were quite far from the shore. It was a shallow grade. So the Maori woman, the tohunga, she was standing quite a distance. I mean, she was very small, like this big in a distance. I couldn't make eye contact with her. And then the doctor began to dunk me underwater, and he would hold me down until I began to flail about. And then he would allow me to come back for air. And then he would dunk me back down as soon as I'd taken a breath. And this process, he repeated and repeated and repeated until I was getting so weak with each return to the surface that I would just collapse on him. I could barely stand up on my own. I would just collapse on him, take a few breaths, and he'd push me down. Honestly, they weren't drowning me. I didn't take gulps of water. This wasn't waterboarding either, but it was very intense and utterly shocking ritual to be in. It put me in a state of utter compliance, and you just have to kind of give up everything, and you're with a person who's physically stronger than you, and they hold you down, and your body begins to flail about because you've held your breath and you just can't anymore, and they feel that and they let you back up again. And at some point when I was utterly weakened, when I'm up and I'm just limp against his body, I noticed that he was sort of making eye contact and with the woman on the shore, with the Maori teacher, and it just seemed like something transpired between them, and he had, like, they couldn't talk to each other, very, very far apart. but it seemed like he got an inspiration, an inkling of what he had to do. And he began to keep pushing me back down again, but now he would press a knuckle into the center of my forehead as hard as he could, which was extraordinarily painful. He later explained that he got the sense that that was where it was most strongly attached to me. And finally, I really can't say how long this all went. Maybe 20-something minutes, I guess, but I really don't know. I began to sense that I was dying. And what I mean by that is that, we all have a certain field of vision that, it's kind of like you move your hands like that. And I had the same field of vision, but it began to move further and further away from me until I was seeing exactly as much stuff, but like in a small hole far away, and the rest of everything was black, and sound seemed to also be traveling from far away. And I also felt physically dissociated from my body, and he led me back to shore. And also it was very cold. So I'm like shivering, probably borderline like hypothermic. And they throw a towel over me, and then he takes me to there was a changing room area for people who wanted to swim. So he took me in there and helped me get out of my wet swim clothes and toweled me off and helped me get into my dry clothes, and then brought me. No, I guess that's a little bit later. But yes, there was a funny exchange where when the world was about this far away, but I'm back on the shore. I began to, and he led me back to the woman, and I wish I could say her name, but I'm honestly not in contact with her, and I don't know if she prefers anonymity, so I'm just not going to say her name. But they said it's over, and then I was reciting Om Mani Padme Hum, which I learned with these Tibetan Buddhists over and over again, and they didn't know this, and they're like, "What are you saying?" And it's like, "What are you mumbling?" And I said, "Oh, it's this mantra for Avalokiteshvara." And they're like, "Why are you saying that?" And I hear my voice like very weak and very far away. "Oh, because I'm dying." And I was convinced I was, and I felt no fear. Everything was just slipping away. I felt no pain. I felt no attachment or regret. It was just like going down this slide and everything's leaving. And they started to laugh. They're like, "You're not dying, kid. You're fine." I was like, "No, you don't understand. I'm dying. Tell my family I love them and bye-bye." And they thought it was hilarious, actually. And indeed, the tunnel reversed and the world slowly started to get bigger and sound became its normal volume and I could feel my body again. That maybe took 5 minutes all told. And then during this, that's when I was in the locker room and he was sort of helping me into my dry clothes. And we came back out and we found the Maori teacher, and she was by her car. And, she said, "Well, you just go home and rest. First, go get some hot food, go get some hot soup, and then go home and rest. And we'll speak again in a week or two. And I'll tell you what happened, and what happens next." So we're almost at the end of this. This might be a good time to take another break if you have any questions.
I have questions, but let's leave until the end.
All right. So with the TCM physician, he took me out to lunch. I remember we had delicious hot tomato soup. Kind of funny. I still remember that all these years later. And I wish there was more of it. Small portions. Food is very expensive in Auckland if you've ever visited there. And then he took me home. And I just basically slept for a long time. And I will say, I felt to the core of my being, the moment that was over, like, it's done. I'm healed. That thing is gone, never to return. I felt like a confidence. And maybe in some level, I could sense that whatever was in me was gone. And again, throwing something out for the utter skeptics out there, maybe this was just such a psychologically cathartic, terrifying ritual that's what it took to sort of like shock my psychology out of its rut. I am more prone to thinking there was something spiritual involved in this, but as I said in the first podcast, I do not have an open third eye. I cannot confirm or disconfirm anything, but I felt profound relief. And as I didn't have to go to work, thanks to this union thing, I had a restful week after that, and however many days it was, again, the physician came and picked me up one evening, and then we drove to a cafe, and we met with the Maori healer, and she was there. And we just sat down for some hot chocolate and some biscuits or whatever. And she proceeded to tell me what she felt that I needed to know. She had very clear ideas about how much information I should get. She said that she told me very little about her own training, but she did tell me she was chosen by her family or extended clan. I don't know if there's a proper term in Maori culture, as I did not live in New Zealand for a long time, but her extended clan, she was chosen to be trained for this sort of work as a girl, maybe around 8 years old or so. And I remember she told me the first training that she had involved being buried in shallow earth with, just under a very thin layer of earth, but totally buried with straws in her nose so that she could breathe, and being told to lie there in the soil that she was buried in until she could hear the grass growing in order to learn stillness. And that she and another boy her own age were chosen at the same time, and they went through this training together. And I have no idea if he also was providing a similar service. I don't know much more about her background than that. But she told me that she receives help from spirits that she's connected to, and they will communicate information to her about the people she needs to heal in dreams. And after the TCM doctor had contacted her several times about my condition, she had received a dream in which she was clearly instructed to break the taboo. As self-important as it sounds, she said that she was told by them that I had important things to do in my life, and that it was not, it was some higher level, I guess. It was decided that it was not to be my fate to succumb to this thing and to be destroyed, that I needed to be healed because I had work that I'm supposed to do in my life that I would not be able to accomplish if I succumbed to this thing. So she therefore knew that it was okay for her to break the taboo. And this is when she, having had this dream, informed the TCM doctor that we would hold the ritual together. And she said that after the two of us walked out into the water, I won't remember the exact order of all of these things, but she clearly is what we would say is a person with her third eye open. She saw a pillar of light descend from the heavens all the way very high up in the sky, a pillar of white light, and surround myself and the TCM doctor who was holding me under the water the whole time. It was there. And I remember he interrupted the conversation, and he had said this as well at lunch the day of the ritual. He just kept thanking me. And he said, "You don't have any idea how grateful I am to have shared this with all of you and have gone through this with you, because I felt God's energy in a way that's unbelievable. That water was so cold. And the whole time I stood out there with you, I felt warm and energized. And I've never felt so full of such beautiful energy. I mean, I can't use his exact words, as I was that day." And he couldn't get over it at lunchtime. He's like, how was I not cold? It just felt like hot from the inside out. And when she described that light, I remember he was animated. It was like, I felt that, and it was just so beautiful, and it was surrounding us and protecting us. And then she said, all the beings, nature sprites and ghosts and so on and so forth that live in that vicinity of that beach knew and sensed the energy and knew that something weird was happening. And they all gathered to see what the hell is going on. But they could not get any closer than a very, very distant. Like, they could only gather at the far edges because the energy was keeping them at bay. And then that a sort of a dome formed around us as well, not very big, not enormous like this pillar that went all the way up into the sky. And it had different facets, and the facets would emanate light that I believe was white, blue, gold, and red, and they would beams of flashes of light would come off of them, and that this protected us as well, and that persisted for quite a while, and then after a time she became worried that the ritual would not succeed. However, a spirit canoe of her Maori lineage, her ancestors, arrived to observe and to lend their help. And she said when that happened, she began to have confidence that it would succeed, that this was kind of a blessing and a contribution. And then Hinemoana, the goddess of the ocean, finally, she arrived. She was the final being to arrive on the scene. And at that point, she was like, oh, well, we're all good. Like, the boss is here. And she said that during that moment of eye contact and communication that she had when I was hanging limp against the TCM doctor's body, he had the sense intuitively that, and it was correct, that this thing was connected to my forehead here, and hence his power nugi that broke that connection. And it was removed, and it came out, and it was taken away by these spiritual helpers. And I asked, what did it look like and where did it go? And she said, basically, I don't remember exact words, but it did not look pleasant, but don't worry about it. There's no reason for you to really think about that. And don't worry about where it went either. That's not for you to know. It's not even your business. It was taken to where it belongs. And just a very gentle manner of speaking, but also very final. And you just felt like, okay, that would, I'm not going to argue with that or go pressing and try to interrogate this. Just felt like, all right, I am communicating with a person with much more wisdom and experience than me. And she is telling me this is not for me to know. And I don't feel the least need to question that. And I don't to this day either. I'm just grateful that that all happened and it worked. Yeah, I don't think there was an awful lot more to our conversation other than, you know, she's basically like, I mean, at that point I was 24 and she was like, go on, live your life. Live a good life. Do what figure out what you're supposed to do and do it. The only other thing I remembered was she advised me stay away from the marijuana for my constitution. It's not a beneficial thing for me. And she did say that her daughter had brought some problems onto herself from smoking weed, and kind of the veil is thin for her, and that was allowing certain things to pierce the veil, and that she had to help her daughter clean, you know, get rid of things that had gotten across her own boundary thanks to the way marijuana was lowering them. And she's like, you know, I've done that enough times. I think next time it's going to happen to my daughter, I'm going to tell her to deal with it herself. But she's just like we're talking about a person who's like kind of a sorcerer, but at the same time, you're talking to them in a Mick cafe at 8 p.m. having a brownie and some hot chocolate, and they just feel so normal, like it's just a mom, you know, like a suburban mom. Yeah, and then that was 2007. Never came back. And I think that's pretty much the story.
Thank you very much for telling that story. Remarkable.
Thank you for listening.
I have a few questions. Perhaps we can discuss, yeah. One of them is, you'd mentioned in a previous episode that this was somehow connected to your lineage.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, she had a dream about that. I totally forgot. That was a big part of the debriefing. Yes, she said that her spiritual helpers told her, and this was something I needed to know, that I had relatives in Scandinavia who you will be glad to know were not Vikings. So you're in the clear, but they might have been sort of berserkers. I don't know, but they were up in Sweden. I have Swedish ancestry and I was born in Sweden. And that they would raid villages. I might have mentioned all of this before, and they would pretty much kill, pillage indiscriminately. And in order to give themselves ferocity and bravery, and possibly, if this is all real, to give themselves actual increased power in combat, they perform black magic rituals to invoke, summon, and bring into themselves strong malevolent life forms. I guess we would fairly call them demons, really would be probably a pretty accurate word. And this was successful for them. They were able to do their black magic rituals successfully, but they paid a terrible price because once in the door, those beings did not have to leave, and they entered the bloodline and resurfaced in many people, in their descendants. Not everybody, but I was one of the ones in which they resurfaced. We had a conversation about why perhaps might things have turned out the way they did in this story I just told. And my thought, which she said sounded reasonable, was that until about 2 years prior, I had been pretty much happy to quite often partake of some very dark behaviors. I wasn't, as a boy, violent. I didn't start to like fight with other people until after I was 20, when, as I mentioned before, a friend of mine took his own life, and I really couldn't process that, and was very, very angry and upset. But prior to that, I wouldn't fight with people, but I had the ability to mercilessly mock people and make them cry. Like it was a malevolence. And I took pleasure in that. And I took pleasure in being utterly destructive. Like the amount of property destruction that I've done in my life. Let's just say I'm glad I grew up in the era before video cameras were everywhere. Otherwise, I'd still be paying off the damages. And maybe karmically I will at some point have to pay every penny back. But my point being was I was a little demon sometimes, a little demon boy. And then I decided to try to stop being that. And maybe I was kind of feeding it and feeding off of it and participating in the kind of, echoes of the sort of behaviors that this thing was first summoned by my ancestors centuries ago to assist in, which is, I wasn't obviously wielding a mace and raiding any villages, but, I took pleasure in extremely selfish behaviors, and sometimes the making other people feel worse. I liked that. Dominating. And watching the way a person's face falls as they deflate because you've gotten under their skin and found their weak spot and poked it. Yeah, and then I really decided I'm not going to keep doing that stuff anymore, and I got involved in Buddhism. And if this thing was all real, maybe every time I did a beat on the mala and said, "Oh, many put me home," maybe it was like, "Oh God, it hurts," and eventually it got to the point where it was like, you know what? I'm not going to give up this shell that I'm sharing. I want it. This is a possibility, possible interpretation. And then a struggle ensued and persisted for quite a while. And it ended at that beach in Auckland.
So when I think of physical injuries or maybe even psychological traumas, or illnesses maybe even, sometimes you recover from something and you need to be, I suppose, careful or aware. You have a certain kind of knee injury or back injury. You may heal it, but you need to remain strengthening the back and mobile. If my hips get too tight, my back starts hurting again, that kind of thing. So I'm wondering, do you have any special considerations now or in the aftermath of this that you follow in terms of what practices you'll do, in terms of what situations you'll be involved in, and so on? Do you have any sense of care, I suppose, or particular attention in that regard?
Well, I don't even so much as flirt with channeling, mediumship, letting things into my being like that. Like I'd mentioned in the other podcast with that fellow in Beijing who wanted me to allow the dragon spirit into my body. It's like, no, 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 no. I do not. I don't like marijuana. I mean, I didn't need an injunction from the Māori tohunga to stop smoking weed. It just doesn't really work for me. But it does give me some of what happens to me on marijuana. Other people need to take a good solid dose of LSD to get there, and I can get it off a very low dose of marijuana. And maybe the veil is just too thin for me. What else? And also, just people in China sometimes say 心理卫生, just mental hygiene, like be careful what you put in that brain. I'm not saying, I mean, I watch violent movies, just like everybody else, but it's just like, yes, practice, you cultivate kindness and compassion and do the work. Yeah, but I, to be honest, once it was all done, and this is also what I felt that the Maori tohunga was also trying to get across, is like, don't linger on all this either, Don't, I don't think I need special considerations that a person who's interested in the spiritual path who doesn't have any of this history wouldn't also have, And there's a phrase, I think it's from the Yellow Emperor's Inner Classic, this ancient Chinese medicine text, but it's also really full of Taoist teachings as well. It's just 正气存内，邪不可干, which is when you have, call it like righteous qi or upright qi, correct, proper qi within, your energy is right, your house is in order. 邪不可干, the pernicious things, evils, cannot disturb you, harass you. And it doesn't necessarily differentiate between external evils and pernicious influences or external. It's kind of the same. You're staying the course, you're walking the straight and narrow, then just don't need to worry too much. And I'm not saying that like this can be interpreted to such a degree that it's sort of like a carte blanche to not ever be careful in the future. But I do think, once you really keep your house in order here, and one shouldn't develop the mentality, and God forbid someone take away from this conversation we're having, the message of it is, oh, I'm not fearful enough and I'm not worried enough about malevolent spirits and demons because this weird guy on the internet, Mattias Daly, apparently had a demon in his body and was triggered from meditation. So I need to like become sort of a prepper, so to speak, spiritually. Some people are afraid the apocalypse is around the corner and they're filling their basement with like meals ready to eat and 5,000 bullets. Like, I'm not trying to say that one needs to have a similar approach spiritually just because the army of demons might be after you because you're saying Om Mani Padme Hum. I do not think that is how it is. I think generally speaking, obviously my story is a rare one. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth telling it. It wouldn't even be interesting at all if everybody was going through this. So the fact that I am on a podcast now telling this odd and uncommon story, the most important thing is that it's an uncommon story. And I think people don't need to read too much into it and just keep on being a good person. And you'll probably be all right.
Have you had any contact with other entities or other experiences of that category?
No, not really. No. I've seen a couple of ghosts, but just nothing, just in passing. Just I think plenty of people do in their life see a couple of apparitions here and there.
Were you ever tempted to learn exorcism? Or to,
No,
no,
no.
why?
I wouldn't even know where to begin. And why? To be honest, the number one thing is, to be honest, it's kind of funny, but it's an honest answer. I've heard that some people, they get trained in these things and they start to see them, right? And then they find out there's ghosts everywhere. And I don't want to be having sex and look over and see like some googly-eyed thing looking at me. Or actually, that's the answer. Like, you know what? I am happy to have that world. This is I think Confucius is famous for having this sort of attitude. He's like, you know what? I'm not saying there's no spiritual world, but I keep that at a distance and I don't worry about it and I don't get involved in it. And, Taoists and Confucians don't agree on everything, but I'm going with the Confucians on this one. Maybe Confucius' reason was a little bit different than mine, but they are a very procreation tradition, so he might have been thinking about similar things. Anyway, that's also, though, I don't think one should go into this unless, like, the people I met were all chosen. The Catholics, they had a spontaneous mission given to them by God. That's their interpretation. The TCM doctor, he told me the whole story of how he first learned these sensing and removing entities. And at first he could see it and he was resistant to it, as his two Maori teachers were like, we know you see it. And he's like, no, I don't. And they said, yes, you do. What do you see? And he said, all right, this sounds crazy, but it looks like there's a half of a fish sticking out of that man's side. And they said, exactly, that's there. We need to get rid of that fish that's stuck in this guy. It's causing him illness. And then, the Maori woman herself was chosen at age 8 or something like that because her elders saw this potential. So personally, I don't think that the universe wants me to do this. And I'm sure I could find a YouTube teacher or a course somewhere. But I think I'd be jumping out of my lane, and I'll pay a price for that. And I just don't want to. I don't want to be in that lane.
I have a couple of other questions. I suppose they're a little bit rapid fire. Depends how long it takes to answer them, of course. When you were in the midst of all that, what was your sleep schedule like? Was it affected at all?
Yes, I was sleeping a lot, and increasingly it went from, normal wanting to sleep 8 hours until it got to the point where it was difficult for me to be awake for more than 10 hours a day. But I wasn't waking up in the morning feeling rested. I was just sort of out. But I felt hugely depleted during the day.
And did you have any dreams during that period? What was your dream life like?
Oh, I did have a couple of weird dreams. But no, nothing I want to talk about here. Yeah.
Oh yes, you mentioned, I ought to remind you about how Taoists explain seeing ghosts.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so as I was saying, I would be in my studio apartment reading in the evenings, and I would sense and visually I would see these movements and these shadowy and sometimes lighter colored shapes, and I would look directly and they weren't there. One will also often hear in Chinese medicine and Qi Gong and Taoist circles where these are acknowledged, because of course, if you're in university Chinese medicine in China, like it's illegal to make films about ghosts in China. Apparently, it's a very anti the atheism enforced by the Communist Party. Even though there's some room for religion, generally speaking, the spiritual realm is not acknowledged outside of designated areas, which includes Taoist temples. And so TCM University does not teach about any kind of demonology whatsoever, even though Chinese medicine texts throughout the centuries, some of them devote quite a lot of, these are like herbal texts will have sometimes decoctions or that are meant for this realm of affliction, and then sometimes some of the most important famous doctors discuss various ghost and demon influenced afflictions. Anyway, if you do encounter the kind of Chinese medicine doctor who has received some of that traditional knowledge, the explanation is generally that as a person's energy levels, their zheng qi, their rightening, their right qi, the correct qi, weakens due to long-term illness or just a person becoming very old, which is partly why they say people would see things on their deathbed. As this energy level becomes so depleted, it's almost like you have a force field that is keeping things that are not of the human realm at bay. And just the constitutional weakness means that that force field is not operating as it should, and you begin to see things that you really shouldn't be. And so it's an interesting thing, because in this aspect of Chinese culture, it is understood and accepted that some people have a ming. They have it's kind of like a mission or an order that they brought with them into this life, that they should be able to see those things. So it's not to say that every person has the ability to see beings of another dimension or another wavelength. That's therefore equates with a diagnosis that this person has a weak qi constitutionally. One could have very strong qi, but one's being is structured in such a way that one sees those things, because that is just the way that one was made. But for most people, especially if they're suffering from an illness, when they're starting to see those things, that's a reflection of the body needing to be built back up to its ideal level of health, in which case those crossings of the veil will naturally diminish. That's a common explanation. And so I think it may be that I was beginning to see those beings in my house because I was getting so weak. Like I said, I was eating for 2 people but losing weight, and I was sleeping, 12, 14 hours a day, but feeling unrefreshed all the time. So yeah, the only other really couple of times I've seen anything like that have been in very different circumstances. I saw a ghost very clearly in Shanghai one day when I was doing standing meditation, and after a long session of Baguazhang, and then I did some closed eye standing meditation, and I very spontaneously saw internally I had a pillar of light, totally ramrod straight, running from Baihui at the crown of my head down to Huiyin at the perineum. I didn't summon this thing. I didn't cultivate it. I didn't try to make it happen. I don't know why it appeared that day, but it was like, wow, there's almost like a fluorescent tube running down the top to bottom of my body. Closed my practice, and I went and walked by a barely lit riverside path, and I saw a man, shoulder and head half transparent, walking down the path. And my first thought was, I didn't see that. Somebody exhaled cigarette smoke and it got caught in the light. And my brain interpreted that brief flicker of distant street light in a cigarette cloud as a head and shoulders. And I was happy with that explanation for myself. But a moment later, I saw it again. And this time I looked straight at it for quite a few seconds. And I was like, oh, okay, that is really there. But I just think my energy system that day, for some reason, reached a certain alignment that opened me up temporarily. And when I saw that guy, I was just happy. I just sort of mumbled Amitofu under my breath and walked away. And the other time when a similar thing happened recently, there was also other circumstances involved, external circumstances that I believe triggered it. And actually, I'll just tell the story very quick. Last summer, a woman that I knew was very into, this Taiwanese woman, into this sort of, generally speaking, spiritualism, not talking about the spiritualist church. And she had a friend who has what in Chinese is called 特殊体质, like a special constitution, which is often a euphemism for being perhaps a little bit open to the unseen world. And this woman had made a candle, which she had added various herbs and minerals to the wax that was supposed to open you up to the seventh dimension. And this friend of mine said, would you like to sit around with me and see what happens if we light this candle? And I was like, okay, nothing better to do. And that night, riding a scooter through a dark path, I just saw, a half transparent person for a moment. And I felt when that candle was burning, I could really feel my energy system was buzzing in a way that was noticeable and not particularly pleasant. And I just said, you know what, I'm not going to buy that candle and I'm not going to use it again. So I do think these things can be opened up. And if one hangs in spiritual circles enough, one hears stories or even meets people who have firsthand experience with that process of learning how to make that a part of one's life if that's on one's path in one's destiny. Not everyone's born with it. Some people have a teacher or even read a book that elicits this.
Why have you decided to tell this story in this context? You told me before that you haven't told the story publicly before, so I'm curious what inspired you to do so today.
Yeah, I actually, after our last conversation, I kind of debated it internally for a while, and I even spoke with my friend, the same guy who I did Push Hands with, who we spoke about, Jeff Chen. He's heard the story. And, neither of us could find a particularly compelling reason to tell it. And I did think of some reasons not to tell it. For example, just sort of creating fear in some people's minds, potentially. Also, in the off chance that this video goes viral, it would probably inevitably be fuel for certain kind of charlatan who might, get out there and be like, oh, I went to New Zealand, and got Maori spiritual teachings, and, is now, and there's so many people like that walking around. But my friend's final comment was just like, he said, I wasn't there, but I know you. And he said, he left a voice recording, and he says, quite funny, he's like, if I heard this story and I didn't know you, I would probably just think it was BS. But I don't think it is, because I think you told it, and as much as a person can, you were being truthful and authentic and sincere, and you never know what will come out of sharing something. But if the sort of circumstances have aligned where this opportunity and this invitation has arisen, then perhaps it's just right to participate as honestly and sincerely as possible, and just allow what happens next to happen. And another thing on my mind is that this stuff, it's true what my Taoist teacher Xuan Wei and many other people have said, that it is a certain certain part of the world, certain linguistic groups, certain history tracing back a short amount of time, that has produced millions, if not billions, of people who have little or no awareness of this thing that was taken as a given and woven into human life, probably everywhere, and still is in many, 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 many places, and sometimes even next door. If you live in Auckland, right, you don't even know. And maybe a certain small number of people need to know this because they need this type of help, or somebody they know who's in their care needs this sort of help, and maybe they were doubting them and rejecting them and even ridiculing them, and maybe in a more grandiose way. I don't know, have you ever heard a podcast called The Emerald?
No.
So my brother put me onto this, and the producer of it, I've only listened to a few, but he ended last year with 2 episodes. I think he called it For the Intuitives, and he makes a very compelling case that reconnecting with the aspect of human reality that I was forcefully brought in touch with, which includes our connections to our ancestors, which can be both positive and negative, our being integrally connected to an entire web of life that is not just the plants and the animals and the fungi and so forth, and that we're already not very respectful to be honest. But even more than that, that this is an essential part of the curriculum that humanity needs to apply itself to in order to dig ourselves out of the death, doom, and destruction spiral that we seem to be spinning around in, possibly with ever-increasing speed, as we look around and it's 2024, and last year was yet again the hottest year ever, and we're 90 seconds to midnight, and we've got a world leader actively throwing around threats of nuclear war. Yes, I mean, we don't need the whole list. Anyone who opens the news and looks at the front page for more than 5 minutes, it's just, it's not a lot of good news. And I think that podcast, The Emerald, made an interesting case, and it's presented by an American native English speaker, probably educated in the modern education system, quite possibly, but I'm not sure, didn't grow up in a household where people sort of were living lives enmeshed with shamanic knowledge, spiritual knowledge that humans possibly need to be enmeshed with, because we are enmeshed with that world. I mean, I don't know if I can express this all eloquently, but I am open to the idea that there is some good to be had by people at least opening their minds to the possibility that there's some reality to all of this. And yeah.
Well, this has been very fascinating indeed. Thank you for sharing this story with such detail. Before we wrap this up, is there anything else on your mind, anything that remains to be said that you'd like to say?
Ooh, I've talked a lot. Probably said more than enough. Yeah, I don't know, just what did Jerry Springer say at the end of his shows? Like, remember, everybody be nice. Whatever Jerry Springer said at the end of his shows after everybody was throwing chairs around, was like, remember to take care of each other. That's what I want to say right now. Jerry was right about that. I think that's about it.
Mattias Daly, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.